All right, this morning we're going to be talking about hooks and components. In part one of our lecture, we'll be covering the virtual DOM versus the real DOM, and we're going to be talking about the virtual DOM versus DOM. At the same time, that we'll be covering state variables. We'll talk about state variables, how they interact with the virtual DOM, and then we'll dive into use effect. What to utilize use effect for? One of the main reasons to utilize use effect is to check the value within a state and look at its current value. A separate a separate way of utilizing use effect will be for handling HTTP request as a condition, and we'll talk about dependency lists here shortly. We'll then talk about conditional rendering. That will be part one of our lecture. We'll likely just interact with the Poke API for the majority of this part. In part two of our lecture, we're going to bring in that JSON file that we utilized yesterday for tasks. We're going to run over our map and filter functions yet again inside of our document or inside of our React project. From there, we'll talk about components, how components work. We'll talk about props within a component, what is props as an object, and then props after being destructured. At this point, does anyone have any questions over what we'll be covering today? All right, everyone. If no one has any questions, let's go ahead and dive into part one of our lecture, which is going to talk about the virtual DOM. Since I'm diving into part one of our lecture, I want to take this opportunity for all of you to walk me through the process of creating a React project with V. How could I do that?
Did you use npm init?
So npm init will start an npm project. That's not really what I'm looking for here.
You
NPM
create v
right.
space dot if for the directory you're already in.
All right, let's do that. So we're going to do npm create vite because I do not want it inside of the nested directory. I'm just going to place a period. That will create my Vite project. So it doesn't ask me for a title. I want to utilize React, JavaScript, and now here we have my Vite project being created.
Now you have to install npm.
Perfect. So
So
great.
npm install.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tim. And why is it that I have to run npm install? What am I missing here in my project that requires me to run the command of npm install?
Your
Modules.
modules and your package lock.
Perfect. So I'm going to run npm install. That's going to take a look at my package.json, come down to my dependencies and dev dependencies, and install all of my node modules and create my package-lock JSON. Awesome. So now I have my actual project installed. All of my dependencies are in. How do I run this server?
You npm dev run dev. Are you going to install Axios first, or do you not need it?
We can install Axios now since we will be utilizing it. So I can install the dependency, npm install Axios, and then we can npm run dev. Oh,
You put a C
I
at the
can
end.
spell. Yes. Perfect. Let's go ahead and open that up. And here is my React project. Now, quick refresher here. What is being rendered on the screen, or how does my React project become rendered on the screen? Can anybody walk me through the process of what happens whenever I run the server and I come to localhost 5173?
Is it just rendering like well it's rendering the HTML obviously from the app.jsx,
All
but
right.
is that using like the DOM?
Yeah, so this is still the DOM, all right? So we grab HTML. I go to localhost 5173. We know that there is an HTTP communication that happens whenever two things or whenever our two servers speak to each other. Where do we? Here we go. So this is still a client to the server being port 5173. It's saying, hey, can we talk? Yes, we can talk. And instead of asking for info from Pikachu, it is actually asking for index index.html. So the index.html comes back along with the JavaScript. So here is index.html and all JS and CSS needed. All right, so our HTTP conversation has just changed a little bit. Now our server isn't working for an API. It's not contacting a database. So we could delete that portion. And instead, the server is just simply returning HTML, JavaScript, and CSS back to the client. All right, so here I am as the client. I go to localhost port 5173, and an HTML script gets rendered. But this HTML script, when it's rendered, it's completely empty. So where does all this code come from?
I'm guessing main. Is it from main.jsx or?
Nice. So I go to main.jsx here inside of my source folder. And main.jsx injects what into that division of root?
The app.
Yeah, app.jsx. Then gets added into that division of root. And that's where we see all of the code that we have here on the right-hand side. All right, so just take a look at that information here. So again, hey, can we talk? Yes, we can talk. Can I have some index.html? Here's the index.html, all the JavaScript and CSS needed. So the application renders. Index.html is being rendered on the screen. And let me go ahead and make that a little bit more clear. There you go. So index.html renders on the screen. That then talks to main.jsx, which grabs the app. Once it grabs the app, it sends it through main.jsx into index.html. And that's how we get this being rendered on the screen. Right? Main.jsx is just essentially a connecting file between our application and index.html. And as of right now, this connection seems pretty straightforward. And you may wonder to yourself, well, if I'm not doing anything other than just passing the app, why do I even have this? We're going to see main.jsx change later on once we start adding a router into our application. But for now, since we're working within our single page application without a router, it's just very straightforward. All it does is grab app.jsx and injects it into index.html. And that's pretty much where we stopped at yesterday. Does anyone have any questions about that? All right, perfect. I'm going to go ahead and go through the cleanup process here. I'm going to get rid of all of my CSS. Because I know I'm not going to be utilizing it. In main.jsx, I'm actually going to remove the strict mode tag. That way it's just rendering the app. What that strict mode tag does, yes, I'm going to remove it. What that strict mode tag does is it renders the virtual DOM twice to make sure that you don't have any sort of misbehavior within your state. But I'm going to remove it because it makes console log statements kind of hard to read because they become repetitive in the fact that it renders my virtual DOM twice. All right. Let me do a little bit of management here, make sure that I only have what I need opened. I come to app.jsx, remove all of this, remove this use state up above. And instead, I'm going to have an H1 header of state and use effect. I'm going to have an H3 header that will hold my outcome. And then I'll go ahead and create an input field. All right. Let me come over to V tier. We have the state and use effect, and actually instead of states, I'm just going to put use state. And I have this Pokemon information. Maybe I add a button there. I'm gonna leave it like this for now, just so we could see what's going on there. All right. Well, here's what I'm currently rendering on my DOM. Let's go over and draw it out. My DOM as of now has an index HTML document with an H1 header, an empty H3 field, and then finally an input field. This is all that's currently being rendered on my screen. Now, where React gets a little bit fancy, or where things start getting really fancy when it comes to a front-end framework, is we start interacting with something called a virtual DOM. What that means is that everything that becomes rendered on the screen becomes rendered on the screen once. But then what React is going to do for us under the hood is it is going to essentially create or generate a copy of everything that the browser is rendering, and it's going to hold on to it virtually. That's why it's called the virtual DOM. We don't see it. We don't necessarily interact with it directly. It is something that's happening under the hood and being managed by React itself. Right, so we have the DOM, which is what the client sees inside of the browser. And then we have the virtual DOM, which is something that's being tracked within React. Well, what's the purpose behind this? Before, we used to do injection utilizing JavaScript, or we used to grab elements with JavaScript and change their specific values by grabbing an element by ID, specifically accessing an attribute, and then adding information. Well, now by having a virtual DOM, we have a state that we can interact with to change values. Let's take a look at an example here. I'm going to simply create a use state. I'm going to say const and passing an array. This array is going to have two variables. One of them being the name of the variable, which in this case I'll say Pokemon. And then the second being the function that will be utilized to update the state. And then in use state, I'll pass the initial value. I'm going to write that down here so that we can all have it. So the first variable is going to be reference or val. The second variable will be the function to update the state. And then this use state, what gets passed into the parentheses, will be the initial value. All right. So here we can see the const Pokemon. Pokemon will be the reference for the state value. Set Pokemon will be the function utilized to update this state value. And then the use state, which is just a function, returns or it becomes initialized. Think about this as a class being initialized with the initial value of an empty string. All right, inside of this H3, I'm going to go ahead and now add the variable of Pokemon. I'm writing straight JavaScript in here. Notice that I'm doing so by just placing curly brackets within my HTML context. All right, so far, what I've gotten here, I've covered two separate points. One, curly brackets inside of HTML will allow me to write strict JavaScript right into my HTML. And then two, when I go to generate a state, useState is a class that when initialized, it returns two values, or it returns an array with two values inside of it. That array that it returns is in the first index, a reference for the value, which in this case we have Pokemon. And in that second index will be a function that will be used to update the state value. All right, let's go and take a look at what our project looks like now. So currently I go useState useEffect, H3 Pokemon. That doesn't show anything. Well, what happens if I change this to, let's say, Zulu? Well, now Zulu shows up inside of an H3 element. This string, which is just a regular set of string, is being referenced to here on line 13 within curly brackets. You could put something like the number 5. And that will also render the number 5. I can place a dot value. That will also work. Something that I can't do is place something like a function. I can't do something like, oh, hey, console.log and expect that to work correctly. That would raise an error. I have to put an actual readable value. For now, let's just stick with Zulu. Now, that's a lot to take in up to this point. I'm going to take a quick breather here and do another recap. And then after that, we'll open up the floor for questions. Again, useState is a class, and it takes in an initial value. Once this class is initialized, it's going to return an array that we can deconstruct. Here's where we're deconstructing set array and setting it to two variables. At index 0 of set array, we're going to have a variable that we can reference to grab the value out of this initial state, right? So the initial state was Zulu, and that is referenced to as the variable Pokemon. And this state will always be referenced to as Pokemon. At index 1, we're going to get a function that we can utilize to update the value of the state. So now I'm never going to say, hey, well, Pokemon equals 3. That's going to throw an error because Pokemon is a const. That's not how it works. I can't just update this value. I would have to update it with set Pokemon. I could say, hey, set Pokemon to 3.
So
this is going to throw an error for now. We're going to see it later on actually being applied, but know that this would be the actual syntax that we utilize. And then I apologize, but I'm going to freeze for questions. Just give me a second to finish covering this. And then finally, we can inject or actually read the value or the JavaScript that we're writing within the HTML by placing it inside of curly brackets inside of the HTML context. All right, now let's open it up for questions. I think I heard somebody start speaking.
yeah, that was me.
Let's hear it.
So the variable name is actually useState, not Pokemon. The useState refers to the array with Pokemon and set Pokemon within it. It's just like you're writing the declaration backwards almost.
So let's see if I could write this under the hood. So essentially what would happen is there is a function here named useState. This function takes in an init value. And what it does is it creates a function. So what it returns is 1, the init value, and 2, a function that will be utilized to update the init value. right? So that's what our use state function here is actually doing under the hood. Now, because it returns it this way, and it returns an array, we can deconstruct said array so that the initial value that got passed, which is Zulu, will be referenced to as Pokemon, and the function that is created within that use state gets set to set Pokemon. Does that help seeing it in code, Tim?
No, it's not that I didn't understand it. I just wanted to confirm that that's essentially what you were doing.
Okay, got it. Did that confirm it?
Yeah, it did. It did. Thank
Okay,
you.
awesome, no problem. Any other questions?
So
So if you go ahead, Jason.
the H3 tag on line 19 is just for readability's sake. It still exists. That's just for us to be able to see it.
Could you say it one more time?
Okay, line 19, the H3 tag is just for visualization purposes for us to see it. It still exists even without that being there.
Yes, it exists even if you don't call it. This is already occupying memory, and it's existing as essentially a global variable within the function of app.
Okay.
So that set Pokemon function, like you set the initial value of use state to Zulu, and then by calling the set Pokemon function, if you like had a function for that, right? Or the set value. And then you pass in like ditto, it would change the use state value to ditto.
Exactly. Yes. Right. So let's take a look at this updating process here. And I'm going to actually change this now. Going to change it over to our Pikachu. And let's write a little bit of JavaScript code there. Let's do 2 uppercase. All right, let me re-render. I don't have any errors. Everything's working great. We have Pikachu to uppercase. That's a string with a JavaScript function. And then if you're working within TypeScript, whenever you could go ahead and create this use state, you're just going to have to specify that it will always be a string or it could be a none type. But let's not dive down that rabbit hole. All right, let's go into updating this function here and working with an input field. So here, I'm going to go ahead and add a value where I'll say that the value is Pokemon. And then I'm going to keep an onChange method. This onChange method is going to capture the event of the change within the input field. And it's going to set the value of Pokemon to the target dot value. So whatever is happening within the input field, that will be the new value for the Pokemon up above. So currently we see that it has Pikachu. Great. Well, now if I wanted to change this, I can say, well, instead of Pikachu, I want it to be Ditto. And you can see that as I'm typing, it's also updating the state right up above. All right, well, what's happening there? Well, now inside of my H3 tag, I have a state variable. I'm going to put it in gold so that it's highlighted, named Pokemon. And this exists in both locations. Well, as I type into that input field, a comparison happens between these two Pokemon variables. Essentially, when I type into the input field, the virtual DOM becomes updated. And because this is a state, it triggers a comparison. Now, this only happens when I interact with state variables. This comparison only happens when something within the state is triggered. This set Pokemon function, when it's being utilized, that's what triggers the, hey, the state was updated, compare the virtual DOM to the DOM. As I update this Pokemon, so when I went from Pikachu to an empty string, well, then it did a comparison and said, hey, are these two the same now? Because on the left-hand side, And this says ditto. But on my right-hand side, this still says Pikachu. Well, because they're not the same, it essentially forces the DOM to make a new request, and it feeds it down, it like shoves it down its throat, and it says, well, now instead of Pikachu, you're now going to say ditto. And it forces the DOM to match the virtual DOM. And that's all happening because I'm using this set Pokemon variable. That's what triggers that re-render. All right, so there I have my reference for a value, which is Pokemon. We can see it in line 3, or excuse me, in line 20. Inside of that H3 component, we have that Pokemon.to uppercase. If I refresh my site, Pikachu is my initial value. But when I go to update my field, my input field, you can see that as the value within the input field changes, the set Pokemon function is being triggered, which triggers a comparison between my virtual DOM and the DOM. And it forces the DOM to essentially write ditto as my user is writing it within the input field. All right, let's open it up for questions.
Did your deleting of the strict earlier allow you to do the to modify things? I'm following along and I can't modify the field.
If you can't modify the field, I would make sure that you have both this value and this onChange attribute in the input field.
Yeah, I do.
Interesting. In that case, there might be something else going on. The strict mode would not stop you from being able to do those changes.
Oh, okay. I figured it out. I was missing a T on target. Typo.
I will do it, of course, no problem.
Good times, thanks.
All right, any other questions? Okay, great. Doesn't seem like we have any questions. Let me go ahead and do another quick example here by showing a greeting. Let's say, hey, we have a separate H2 header. This one will say it has a greeting. And I'm going to go ahead and add a button. This button will say change greeting. I'm just going to write a little bit of code here. So I'm going to have this const of greeting to set greeting. Going to make that equal to a use state of hello. All right, let me erase the ridiculous amount of error messages that populated in the time that it took me to write that. So there we can see hello. Now I want to integrate a function that when I click on this button for change greeting, instead of hello, I get goodbye. How would I go about doing that?
I'm guessing use onClick, right?
Okay, so I would have an onClick attribute on my button. Great.
And take in set greeting.
Yeah, takes in the function of set greeting. And what value am I going to pass into that?
What we're trying to change to.
Perfect.
Oh, good. Okay, good.
Goodbye.
Okay.
Nice. Now, just to clarify, when I created this state variable, the initial value was hello. That's why within that H2 header, we can see hello being displayed. Now, when I add that onClick function, I want to manipulate the state. So because I am updating the state and forcing the virtual DOM to do a comparison, which is what we see here in gold here, asking, hey, are these two the same? I need to do that utilizing the function that's being passed in or that came back within that state variable, which in this case, it's set greeting. And that's why we see it on line 22. We're calling a function that passes in a value. So that's why I'm writing the syntax here. And I have set greeting to goodbye. Now, if I go into my project, I refresh it, everything's working well. I click on it, the virtual DOM changes. The value for H2 instead of hello becomes goodbye. It runs the comparison between the two. Well, now they're no longer equal. So it forces the new value to the DOM and our client gets goodbye rendered on the screen. Does anyone have any questions regarding useState?
So if like on the function like set Pokemon or set greeting, if we have it where like we want, say you type in a Pokemon and instead of just putting in the Pokemon's name, you want to put in like the moves that the Pokemon has, the move set for it. Could you create outside of like the const greeting, set greeting, could you define the set greeting function and like describe what you're like do like the Axios HTTP request, hold the data, get the move sets, and then return that? Like, can you define the function and then tell the function what to do? Or is it just kind of like set? Um, and you can't really change it that much.
Got it. So the function of this second function, which is, I believe, what you're referring to, the setting of a value, that you can't really manipulate. Once it's created, its entire purpose is to change the value of the initial state. Which you're talking about, where let's go ahead and try to do a little bit of practical application with what you're referencing to here. All right, let me make sure that we're supposed to stop at conditional rendering. Okay, great. Let's move into our next portion here. We have this input field. We're able to grab information. And let's actually turn this into a form now. All right, so there's my form. I'm going to add an input field here for type submit, just so that it's available for me. Great. Let me get rid of the screening information so that it's no longer in the way. And let's start talking about making a little bit of a request here. So I'm going to do const get Pokemon info. This again will be an asynchronous function. I'm going to say let data be equal to await Axios dot get, and then this is going to raise an error because it's not tracking that I have Axios. So I'm gonna go ahead and import that. Oh, I can spell, I promise. That's going to send it to the Poke API, which I do not have open. Instead of putting ditto here, just gonna go ahead and call that Pokemon value. All right, so it's going to send the request to the Poke API. That's going to return the response. From response, I just want data, and I just want to set. Let's make a new value here. So const Pokemon data set Pokemon data. I'm gonna make that equal to a useState. I'm just gonna set this one to null. I'm gonna say, hey, nothing exists there just yet. When that comes back, I'll set my Pokemon data to the data that is being returned. All right. Well, now I want this to happen once the form is submitted. So I'm going to add it as an onSubmit method. With that said, I'm going to pass in the event and do the whole event dot prevent default here. Come over to my form, say onSubmit, pass in the event to the get Pokemon info event. All right. Well, let's see what happens here. I'm going to go ahead and say at the end of this, I want to console.log what is Pokemon data. And at the beginning of my function, I want to console.log what is Pokemon data. Now, when I think about this, oh, actually, let me go ahead and, there you go. That first console.log should show me null, and that second console.log should show me an object, right? That makes sense because I know that data will be an object attribute that comes back from my request. So let's take a look at what happens here when I click on submit. When I click on submit, I get two messages saying null. Nothing is being updated even though I'm utilizing the set Pokemon data. Well, why is that happening? Well, it's not that something isn't being updated. It's actually just the fact that our regular JavaScript, as it's reading from top to bottom, it is unable to recognize that the value for Pokemon data has now changed, because that is all being tracked within the virtual DOM. So if it's being tracked within the virtual DOM and I need to keep track of something or keep track of the value of some information, well, how could I do that? How am I going to make sure that this information is being updated and that I can see the current value within the state? Well, that's where the tool of useEffect comes in. So useEffect is a function that takes in a function. A function that takes in two parameters. The first being the function to execute, and the second being a dependency list, which is when this state changes, trigger the function. All right. So the first one is the function that I wanted to trigger. What I wanted to do is I wanted to console log the Pokemon data. You'll see that we get this this log on to the console from line 30. And then the second portion will be a dependency list. If I leave it empty, that means it's only going to happen once, whenever it's rendered. I can change the value of this to ditto, send my request, and nothing's going to change. I'm clicking on submitting, nothing is going to change there. But the moment that I add into the dependency list that I wanted to keep track of Pokemon data, I refresh it, we can see that it's null. But now when I send my request and my request comes back, we can actually see an object with the key value pairs from the response of the Poke API. So what's happening here? What is this useEffect doing? All right, well, I click on submit, or excuse me, the initial render happens. And upon the initial render, this console.log is triggered. And we can see that in app.jsx on line 30. Great. Well, my initial value is null. And that's why we see that showing up in my console. When I submit, well, I click on submit. My onSubmit method gets triggered. that sends a request to the Poke API to grab the data attribute, and it sets that value to Pokemon data. Well, when I set that value to Pokemon data, this question mark or this comparison also triggers a use effect. Right, so use effect dependency list. So if there's anything that has this variable of Pokemon or Pokemon data or whatever the variable is that we're changing inside of the dependency list, any use effect that have it within the dependency list, then the function will get triggered yet again. And that's why we see this second log still from line 30. Well, the value of Pokemon data changed, which is within the dependency list. And because the value changed, it triggers the function that we passed as our first parameter, and it logs into our console the Pokemon data. And that's use effect. Does anyone have any questions about that so far?
Can you go over what you mean by like dependency list again? I'm like blanking on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe dependency list might be the wrong word. Let's go ahead and call it dependency array. And what I mean by that is that this value here, this is the array, and I'm telling it that the function, which is our first parameter, will be triggered every time this state changes. I could add something else in there. Let's go ahead and let's say I put the Pokemon in there as well. I'm gonna refresh my page. I see no. Well, every time I change the value of Pikachu, I am updating the state of Pokemon. All right, because of the set Pokemon function on line 44. As I continue to update the state, well, every time the state changes, use effect says, oh, well, according to my dependency list, I'm supposed to keep track or keep an eyeball on both of Pokemon data and Pokemon. So every time the value of either one of those states changes, I am going to trigger the function that was passed as my first parameter. And so I change it, bring it back to ditto. You'll see all those logs onto my console. That's because I'm updating the value of Pokemon. But when I click submit, well, now I updated the value of Pokemon data. So we're still getting that console.log where data is now different. Does that answer your question, Chase?
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
All right. Any other questions regarding use effect and use state?
Use effect, is it tied to any specific thing other than the dependency array? Like it'll work for anything you put in there. It's not tied to a specific use state, right?
Right. It's not tied to a specific use state. It will always keep track of the dependency list. The only other thing to consider is that it will always happen upon the component rendering. So upon the initial render, me going to the application, when I refresh this, the use effect will be triggered one time without the dependency list being activated. After that, any repetition of that use effect will happen depending on the dependency list.
And you can only have one of these per app because it's called use effect and you can't rename it.
you could actually have multiples.
Okay.
Yeah, so let me go ahead and put this here. So I could have another use effect. And what this use effect can do here is, let's say I want this one to console.log the value of Pokemon, and then set Pokemon as a dependency array.
Okay, I understand.
Yeah. Awesome. Any other questions?
But I guess for practical purposes, you only need one use effect function.
No.
I mean, because Tommy to me it looked like you could throw in as many dependency lists as you wanted to.
No, because the what really separates the use effects are the functions that you want to happen. So you could have multiple state variables, or you could have the same state variable inside of multiple dependency lists, but the behavior that you want to happen, so that function, that first parameter, may be different, even though it's the same dependency array. So you could have multiple use effects inside of one script. I've seen it to where there's up to 3 or 4 use effects. Does that answer your question, Jason?
Yeah.
So like in a practical example, like on our Pokemon thing, we're like loading the actual pictures, right? We could have like a button where if the person like clicks that button or that checkbox, once that is triggered, it like changes that use effect calls the function to change like the rendered image of the Pokemon from like the normal to like the shiny version.
That would be a good use right there. Once that gets triggered, the use effect would take care of that functionality. All right. Awesome. So there's our get Pokemon data. We have our use effect already set, or we have multiple use effects set. Well, now we can even go as far as doing a little bit of conditional rendering. Now we're going to dive into the next concept here. I want to render an image that has a source. That source will be within Pokemon data at sprites, front, default. I'm going to get an error. It's going to tell me, hey, the properties of null don't have an attribute named sprites. Why is that happening?
Because you haven't run the query on the form submit yet.
Yeah, so Pokemon data, its initial value is null. It doesn't have a sprites attribute. So how do I change that? Or how do I handle for this information? Well, what I can do is I can do a ternary statement and have conditional rendering. Meaning I can say, hey, if Pokemon data has information, I put a question mark that equates to truthy or falsy. If it does, render my image. If it does not, I don't want you to render anything. And now I have this Pikachu here. Once I submit my form, it sends for the request. So again, everything's empty. Submit my form, it sends the request. And once the value of line 17 changes from null to an object, well, now this becomes truthy and it renders my image. When it was null, it was falsy. So it didn't return any code. And that's conditional rendering. If something is true, it will render the first option. If something is false, it will render the second. Does anyone have any questions regarding conditional rendering?
So in this case, like the Pokemon data dot sprites dot front default, if that was null, because like some in this example, some Pokemon don't have like images or like if you use like the GIFs or whatever, what would it do in that where the actual value itself, like the data exists, but the actual value you're setting as a source is null? Would it just automatic to null?
You would have to handle that edge case yourself with extra code. It wouldn't just automatically set it to null.
Okay, thanks.
Of course. All right. Awesome. So currently I'm utilizing useEffect to just log information onto my console. But I have a little bit of a weird behavior here. When I go and refresh my page, even though I have Pikachu as my initial value, I don't have a picture for Pikachu unless I actually submit the form. Well, I want to fix that. I want to make sure that this get Pokemon info happens every time the page renders. How do I do that?
You put that function inside a use effect, so when you land on the page, it'll run it automatically.
Awesome. So I'm going to go ahead and create another use effect here. And I'm just going to put it down below so that we can see it happening. This use effect, well, it's going to take in a function as the first parameter. This function, what it's going to do when executed is it will get Pokemon info. And I want this to happen every time the site renders. Well, let's see what happens when I refresh my page here. Now it's giving me an error. Let's see what this error is saying. Uncaught and promise type error, read properties of undefined, get Pokemon info. Interesting. Line 20. Let me take a look here. Got it. It's because it's happening from the event prevent default. I'm trying to think a way to pass in the parameter. Here's what we'll do. All right, let me make sure everything works here. And then I'll cover the information that I just did. All right, so everything works great. The issue that we were getting was that our function was expecting an event. When I passed it into this use effect, there was no longer an event being passed in. This function is now being triggered upon the application rendering. As soon as the application renders and this component of app makes it into the screen, we'll see those console log statements. The first one being null, the second being Pikachu, and then we get this object. Where's this object coming from?
It's the data from Pikachu.
Yeah, it's because now this Pokemon data has changed, which means it triggers this console.log, and that's where we get this information. All right. Now, when it comes to our form and the new syntax, or not necessarily new syntax, but I don't believe we've seen this before, I'm still passing the form event. But I am now calling a series of functions. I'm not just calling one. I'm grabbing Pokemon, but I also need to stop the default behavior of this event. So inside of this function call, I am passing in an array. In that first function, I am stopping the default behavior of the form. And that second function is getting that Pokemon info. That way I don't have to worry about passing the event into this get Pokemon info function. All right. Does anyone have any questions regarding use state, use effect, or conditional rendering?
Yes. So if we wanted to, I guess, render this automatically anyways, why are we preventing the default?
The default behavior is of the form. So if I take this event.prevent default off and I go and change this to ditto, and then I submit, you see how everything got refreshed?
Yeah.
That's because the DOM itself, not the virtual DOM, but the entire DOM within the actual browser is being refreshed. A new request is being sent to the
Okay.
server. Yeah. So because I don't want that to happen, I prevent the default behavior of the form. All right. Any other questions?
This is gonna be a very dumb question, but why are you using the blue parentheses in line 44 and 46? What is the purpose of the blue bracket, curly bracket?
Yeah, so that's what allows me to write JavaScript inside of the HTML components. So you see that within my return statement, I am now writing HTML, but I also want to write JavaScript in there every now and then. So in order to be able to write JavaScript within the HTML, it starts off with curly brackets. So this is just a query statement in JavaScript where I'm asking, hey, is Pokemon data a truthy or falsy variable? Because it is if it is falsy, return nothing. If it's truthy, I want you to return image with the source. And then again, I'm writing JavaScript. So there's another set of curly brackets nested, and that's why they're yellow. And that's what points to Pokemon data.
Oh, thank you.
Of course. All right. I'm going to do a quick recap over use state and use effect here. Again, use state. It's essentially a class that takes in an initial value. It's going to create a function that will set the value. And what it does is it returns an array, one where you can reference that initial value as, and the second is the function that you can use to change that value. So again, the variable that we can reference, the variable that, or excuse me, the function that we can use to set a new value, and then we have the initial value. Another way to think about it is we have our getter, kind of like we've seen in Python. We have our setter, and then we have our init value. Asynchronous functions we've already seen. Use effect, again, it is a function that takes in two parameters. One being a function, and the second being a dependency list. Use effects will trigger upon the element mounting or the component mounting, regardless of the dependency array. It will always trigger upon the component mounting. The dependency array is if after that first mount or after the component is mounted, if I still want this function to be triggered upon any state variable changing, I will put it within the dependency array. When the state variable of Pokemon data changes, I get that log to my console for a new value. So now if I send it to Charizard, and I click on submit, I get a new log to my console for all of that object or that new object because the state of Pokemon data changed. So this console.log statement gets triggered. All right. I'm going to open up for questions one more time. Does anyone have any questions regarding use state, use effect, or conditional rendering?
So when you're changing the state, you're changing the virtual DOM, which then invokes the change state in the DOM that you see, that you interact with.
Yes. So I changed the state of Pokemon from, because its initial value was Pikachu. All right. Well, I changed it from Pikachu to be Ditto. And let me just put that in red now. So now because it's Ditto, it does a comparison. In this comparison, I'm asking, hey, is Ditto the same thing as Pikachu? Well, it's not. So because it isn't, I want to force it to be equal. Whoa. And I'm going to do that by treating the virtual DOM as the source of truth. Fix my arrows here, make it a little bit prettier. Does that answer your question, Jason?
Yeah, I got one more. It might be unrelated. So, I mean, if it is, it's okay. We can talk about it another time. But what about how do you do in styling like within the HTML that you're returning? Like, let's just say you just want to change the background color or just change the H3 color to something simple.
You would do style and then background color red. You just put it within two curly brackets.
Yeah, because I was struggling with that yesterday. So I was just curious how you did it.
Of course, no problem. All right, any other questions?
Just to confirm your third use effect, the reason your argument list is blank is because you only want it to run on the initial run and then never track anything, right?
Exactly, yes. All right, perfect. If there aren't any other questions, I'm going to go ahead and pause our recording here. All right, everyone, for part 2 of our lecture, we're going to utilize this tasks that we had from yesterday's lecture, and we're going to utilize these tasks to iterate through them, create components, and then cover props and how they work. We're essentially moving into the part of reusable code that we can have here. All right, so here we have a to-do list. We have tasks, and we can save them inside of some state so that we can change the state variable and then have the update being happening between the DOM and the virtual DOM. These tasks are within this task.json. It is a file that I've created. Just in case someone is attempting to follow along, I'm going to go ahead and share the code to this file here in the Zulu questions channel as well, so that you could just copy and paste it. You'll notice that this JSON file is within my source directory. That way I can utilize it within my app. Great. So now I'm going to go ahead and create this useState variable. So const tasks, column set tasks. And I'm just going to name this JSON tasks and make that equal to a useState of JSON tasks. Now I want to see its initial value, so I'm just going to simply create a use effect here that will console.log tasks. And I want to see it every time the factor of task changes. I'm going to go ahead and refresh my page. And here we can see that tasks is an array of 7 objects, all of which are holding the independent tasks. And we have the keys of ID, title, and completed. Great. Well, yesterday we covered the map and filter functions, and today we're going to look at a little bit of a more practical application of these map and filter functions. One is I want to make sure that I can iterate through every single one of these tasks and render some HTML. Well, we talked about how to use this with JavaScript. We can generate a for loop. We can then create an element utilizing document.createElement, creating a list item, and so on. But here, now that we're within a React environment, there's got to be a more efficient or effective way of doing this. What we can do is we can create a list item.
I'm sorry to interrupt real quick, but in line 2, did you literally change tasks to a JSON format when you changed it from tasks to JSON.tasks?
No, it was already in JSON format. This is just a variable that I'm using to reference it as.
Okay.
All right. Awesome. So now that I have this unordered list, I can go ahead and map through my unordered list and render each individual item. Whereas before, I might have written some code that looks like this. So for let task of tasks, that can say document or new li be equal to document.createElement. Then I could pass in a list item, and then I can say list item dot inner HTML or excuse me, it's going to be something like this, right? Where I can have, hey, well, this is going to be something like a bullet point saying, all right, well, here is the title. And let me go ahead and add this little JavaScript stuff there where I can say task.title. And then I can say, well, is it completed? And I can pass in task.completed. Right, well, there's what I could have done before to have this application rendered the way I wanted to. And it would have created all of those list items, and then I could have just appended them to the UL, right? I can say, hey, well, now that I have this information, I can say ul.append child, and what I can append is the new list item. I have it as commented out because we don't have the UL, and we're not going to actually grab it. Well, this is one way of writing that for loop. And this is the way that we used to do it with just plain old vanilla JavaScript. This is what we've learned up to this point. But now that I'm within React, I can utilize the map function to return HTML. I'm going to be writing JavaScript. And because I'm going to be writing JavaScript, I have to place this map function within curly brackets. I can say tasks.map for every task within. I want to iterate and return. Because I am returning, I am not going to put curly brackets. I am going to put open and closing parentheses because I am now returning something. And what I will return will be a list item. And I can just copy and paste this text that we have here. Well, there you go. Right, we were able to iterate through the list of tasks. We're doing that utilizing the map function. As we're iterating through the list of tasks, we are returning for every task a list item that has the title and the completed component. I could take it a step further if I really wanted to. I could do something like, hey, well, I do want to return a list item. What this list item is going to look like is it's going to hold the title. And it will hold the task.title. Within here. And this is only supposed to return one component, so you may have to put it inside of fragment tags. I can have something like, hey, well, completed status is task.completed. And then I can say, well, what is the ID? Say task.id. And just like that, I have all the attributes of my list being rendered on the screen. I am iterating through the list. I am only returning one JSX component. That one JSX component, I have it wrapped. These are called fragment tags. You can utilize these fragment tags in case you want to group things in without having to create a parent division or a parent element. I don't want to create a parent element. I want them to all fall within this UL. So I just created a fragment tag saying, hey, all of this is grouped as one, treated as one independent component. I am getting an error here. Oh, it's actually not an error, it's a warning. I'll cover that here shortly. But before I go into that warning, does anyone have any questions about how we're iterating through this list of JSON tasks in order to create list items and return them as HTML directly into our React project.
Why is completed not returning true or false?
Got it. So task.completed is a variable. So because of that, we can just say, hey, we can put a question mark and say yes or no. Because it's a Boolean, that's all. Any other questions?
I'm assuming the reason for the use of map and filter is that if you're gonna do some inline logic, it's just more efficient to use map instead of a loop because it'll be a little bit cluttered, I'm assuming.
So when you go through a loop doesn't return something.
Hmm.
Yesterday, when we talked about map and filter, both map and filter return a new copy of the array. So they return values. That's the reason why we're not utilizing for loops, is because map is actively returning, in this case, HTML, right? It is returning a list of HTML items. Whereas if we would have done a for loop, that wouldn't return anything. I would have had to manually inject each one of these list items into that UL. Does that answer your question, Kay?
I was gonna say, so even so doing this logic, but how does it append it to the parent? Be- Just because it returns a list doesn't mean that the list is being anything done with it.
So how is it ending up within the parent? Is that your question?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great question. Let's take a look here. Let me make that transparent one more time. Fix all of my stuff here. So we have index HTML, right? And inside of an index HTML, well, I have a UL. And then I have my good old array of objects. And so on. All right. Well, inside of this UL, what exactly is going on here? What am I doing in this JavaScript? I'm not injecting information. Here, I am literally creating elements and then inserting them into this unordered list, right? The unordered list is created, and then after the entire HTML renders, some JavaScript then starts creating list items. Here in React, that's not the way it's working. In React, what we're doing is we're still creating our HTML context. Oh, there we go. There you go. We're still creating our HTML context. We're starting that return statement, but we're taking a quick pause in this task.map portion, right? It's not reading the entire script and then running JavaScript. It's pausing here at this task.map. Now, what this task.map is doing is it's essentially running something that goes along these lines. It says tasks.map. Well, I want every task to render the following. I'm just going to leave a little bit of space there. Well, what every task is rendering is a list item. Oh, let me fix that there. It's a list item that holds an unordered list with two list items inside of it. So that's what my mapping function is doing. But just like we talked earlier, a map function returns a list. So in this example, we have 3 objects. Well, what this map function is actually doing is it's returning the following. All right, so all of this is the return value of my map function up above. And all that's happening here is once it finishes this function and it takes the return value, it simply just places it within the UL element without having to grab a parent. And then it continues with the remaining of the script. I'm not sure if that fully answered your question, Kenny. Did that address your statement?
So since map returns HTML, it, in a sense, the way it, okay, so it goes down, it does whatever it has to, and then it reads HTML's value, which is just outputs like any other HTML value.
Right. It treats it as an output from the map function.
Okay, and the old way would have been, even though it does that logic, since a loop does not return anything by nature, you would have to call a parent, create this element, and append it to the parent that you called, which is injecting, right?
Exactly. So the other method that we're talking about here, which is doing the for loop that we have up above, it would have ran through the entire script, finished all of the HTML, and then afterwards, one by one, injected one item at a time. Whereas what we're doing here is we're creating the entire return value and then placing it as if it were actual HTML already written within this return concept.
Okay. I think it's, I will have to mess around with it, but it's starting to make sense since the return just becomes HTML. That's all.
Exactly. All right. Any other questions?
So I guess, you need a multiple fragment tags per function. So I see, so if you scroll down, do you mind just scrolling down a little bit from line 18 so we can see the entire return? So the entire HTML, for instance, is line 19 to 32, but then anytime you call like like another function like map or something, like in the middle of this entire return statement, you need to always keep adding more fragment tags. So, yeah. Yeah,
You
so,
do,
so, so anytime you call a function, you're going to add more of those.
you do not need to add a fragment tag every single time. If you're only returning one component, then you will be fine. So for example, if I were to, let me clear all my drawings here. If I were to take this list item and take it off and nest it down below, well, now there's only one list item that's being returned. So because there's only one list item, I don't need those fragment tags on the outside.
Okay. So because you have multiple items, that's why you need the additional fragment tags.
Exactly. Any return statement can only return one component at a time. So for example, in this one above, I have an H1 and a UL. But I don't want to create a parent division that I'm going to have to create design for, make sure that there's no borders, et cetera, right? I don't want to put it within a nested box. Because I don't want to put it within a nested box, I just place the fragment tags, making all of this be considered one single block of code.
Okay.
All right. Any other questions? All right.
And to be clear,
Oh, Sen-
clarifying thing. To be clear, components, fragment tags, all these things are not technically native to HTML. They're just things that we have to keep in mind with React.
Yes, that's correct. So as of right now, we haven't covered components yet, but fragment tags are specifically for React. I'm not sure if other front end tools have them as well, but I believe this one's special to React. And then the map function, it's not special to React. Other front end tools have similarities to this, but this is not the same as writing HTML.
Got it. It's just the way you would do JSF. It's a new
Yes.
thing onto itself that's parent HTML and JavaScript.
Right.
It's a whole new language, right? That's what we're looking at.
Not necessarily a whole new language. Well, yes, it's a mixture of HTML and JavaScript, right? Coming together. All right. So now that we have this information, let's go ahead and move forward and start applying some of our filter functions for now. And I need to take off my pencil. There you go. I'm going to leave this for loop here just for reference. But I'm going to set a couple of different functions. I want to make a function that will set tasks completed. And I want to create a function that will set tasks incompleted. So I'll tackle the first one for us, and then I'll have all of everyone else walk me through handling the second one. So again, the filter function returns a copy of the original array. Because of that, I can set the state of tasks to the return of the filter function. You can say tasks.filter. I'm going to reference every task. And what I want to capture is I want to capture all the tasks that are completed. Let me add a button here that will allow me to maneuver this. Let's say button completed only. And let's do a button as well as all tasks. Here I'm going to add an onClick function that will set tasks to JSON tasks again, since that's the original value there. And then I'm going to add an onClick function that will set completed tasks. Let's take a look at this. Going to open up my code over here. Here I have my all tasks. If I click on completed only, and let's pay attention to our use effect as well. Let me refresh this. All right, we'll cover that warning here shortly. So my use effect is telling me that, hey, there's 7 items in here. When I click on completed only, now there's only 2. Only 2 of those tasks have been completed, and only 2 tasks are rendering. If I go back to all tasks, now we're back to 7. And it has all of the JSON tasks that we were holding before. And so the moment I click on this button for completed tasks, this set completed tasks function gets triggered. What it does is it sets the tasks. Again, remember, when we're talking about use state, we're talking about a getter, and a setter, and then our initial value. I am setting the value of tasks to the return value from filter because it returns a copy of the original array. And I am filtering through the tasks to only grab the completed tasks. That updates the state of tasks. Because it updates the state, it triggers this use effect from our dependency array. It logs the new number of tasks to my console. And because the original value that we're iterating through has changed. Again, use state makes the virtual DOM do a comparison. They're no longer matching. So it forces the new HTML into the browser. And so let's go into refreshing this information here. On localhost 5173, you can see that I have a warning. I click completed tasks. Now I only have 2. Go back to all tasks, and I go back to having all 7 of my tasks. All right. Let's open up the floor for questions. Does anyone have any questions over how we're handling this change of all tasks and completed tasks, and why the virtual DOM and the DOM are updating the way they are?
Can you put more than one use effect in one component?
Yes, I can't put more than one use effect in one component. I can have multiples. In part 1, we covered an example of it. You can go ahead and take a look here. We had a use effect where the functionality was logging.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay. Now it makes light bulb.
Awesome. All right. Okay, great. Well, now that we implemented that, let's go ahead and implement a incomplete task only button. How do I go about doing that? Let me go ahead and start calling on people at this point. And let's hear it from Jason Anderson. You're muted. Every time.
Every time. So you would basically just call the set task again,
All right.
and then you would pass it the filter task, so task.filter, and then you would do task, and then you would throw that into task not task completed. So yeah.
All right. Awesome. And where would I add this function to? Rachel.
Can you hear me? Add an on click?
All right. And I'm assuming that's to this button here.
Yes. And then parentheses, set tasks incompleted.
All right. Easy peasy. Let's go ahead and take a look at what we have here now. I'm looking at all tasks. I can go to completed only. Go back to all tasks. I have all 7 of them. If I click on incomplete, well, now I only have the incomplete tasks being shown. Well, then the question becomes, well, what happens if I click on completed tasks from there? Well, completed tasks is now empty. Why is that happening?
Because you're filtering an already filtered list.
Yeah, I'm filtering the current value of tasks. So if I always wanted these buttons to always be working, I can just change it to where rather than grabbing it from tasks, let me go ahead and do it this way. I can grab from JSON tasks. Refresh my page. Let me clear out all those messages. There you go. Can go to completed tasks, go to incomplete tasks, and so on. And I was able to manipulate the state. All right. Just real quick, I am not passing an argument to these 2 buttons here on line 32 and line 33. And because I am not passing an argument, I just want to make sure everyone is tracking. I do not need to make an arrow function the way I've been doing so. All right, I can always have it empty. It doesn't take in any parameters. So because it doesn't take in parameters, I can pass in the functions just like so. And everything would still work properly. At that point, it's syntactial sugar. All right. Does anyone have any questions over map or filter and how to properly utilize either one of them within React?
I didn't notice, but did that warning that you kept on getting, did it fall off your screen once you've changed the variable to JSON.tasks? I'm just saying, yeah. So because you kept like hinting at a warning, you were gonna talk about a warning you kept getting like on the developer tools. Okay,
Got
you
it.
still have that. Okay.
Yes, I still have it. Let me go ahead and go through that. So here it's telling me, hey, each child in a list should have a unique key. That is just a key attribute. What I like to do, especially if I already have an ID component, or if I'm interacting with an API and that API returns objects with ID, I set the key to the ID. And you do so doing this. So you set key, and then you can say task.id, because that ID is supposed to be unique. So now when I refresh it, I get no warnings. Now that key brings a little bit of extra functionality to things that you can do to independent components. We're not going to be covering that here inside of Code Platoon, but it's definitely something that I would look into on your own time, what kinds of functionalities you can apply utilizing keys. All right. Any other questions?
Can you show the JSON real quick?
The JSON file? Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, now I see how this is working.
All right. Awesome. Okay. It doesn't look like we have any questions. So now let's start talking about components here. Now we've already created a component. We have an isolated line of code that we want to make sure is repeated in other places. But we need to specify how this is going to work. So let's take a look here. I have app.jsx. I'm going to open up my terminal. And utilizing my terminal, let me knock into part 2 real quick. I'm going to dive into my sources directory. And in my sources directory, I'm going to open up a new directory named components. Inside of this directory, I am going to create a file named list item.jsx. And this is just standard convention. Whenever you're naming or creating components, you want to place them within a component directory. And then you want to name the file itself starting with a capital letter. All right, so list item.jsx. I go in there, create my function. And I'm just going to simply have my function return a list item for now. And we'll take the opportunity now to start talking about exporting and importing. So let me go ahead and comment out this line of code here. Put I am a list item for now. Now let's talk about exporting and importing. Whenever you're exporting this file here, we can take a look at app.jsx and we'll see that there's an export default statement there. If I add an export default statement to the bottom of my file, I don't know who it is, but someone has a hot mic. All right, so if I add this export default statement to the bottom of my file, that is going to only export the function of list item. If I make another one or another function named, I don't know, this, let's call it myfunc. and I try to export my func as well, or I need to export my func from the same file, I wouldn't be able to. Because as of right now, I'm explicitly telling this file that the only thing that's going to be exported out of it will be list item, nothing else. If I would like to have multiple exports, then I would just take off the default statement. Now that's as far as exporting from within the file. What difference does it make once I start importing it? Well, when I go to import right now, if I wanted to import my list item, oh, excuse me, you'll notice that list item populates within curly brackets. That is because this export component is essentially creating an object of key value pairs, where the key is the name of the function and the value is the function itself. So when I go to import, I'm doing object destructuring and grabbing that list item. All right, I can pass it in here just so that I could stop getting that error finally. So I'm just going to pass it in. Now we see I am a list item populating on the screen. But now what's the difference if I use the export default statement? Let's go ahead and change that. I'm going to take off that export statement from my func. I'm going to add export default list item. I'm getting an error. Well, that's because now I don't have an object that I'm doing object destructuring for. So because I don't need to do object destructuring, I could just call the one list item itself. Export will create an object that I need to utilize destructuring from and allow me to export multiple functions from one file. Export default will not create an object. It will export the one item, and only the one item will be exported from said file. Does anyone have any questions regarding exports or your imports?
Sorry, I got a little bit lost on that. Could you just give me a brief? I'm a little confused. Export default on the end will only allow you to do the one that you've defaulted. But if you're saying you remove that and before constant list item, you say export, then you can import as many of those as you want per file.
Exactly. Yes. So
Okay.
I can comment this out. Add export to both of these. And now I can export both of these functions.
Okay. And can you go back to your other file so that I can see the import?
Yes. So that would change my import now because I'm exporting multiple functions.
Mhm.
I would have to grab them from the object.
So you don't have to import in the, okay, import, there it is.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense.
Awesome. All right. Any other questions?
I was taking down notes real quick. So if you export default, you don't have to have an import statement, or you can just import it by the name and that's it.
You still have to have an import statement. It's just by
Yeah.
the name without the curly brackets.
Okay, that makes sense.
And then you might be getting into this. I might be getting ahead of the lesson, but how would can you pass arguments into those functions if you were to call them in your app.jsx?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we're going to be covering that here shortly once we start going into props. Awesome. All right, let's go ahead and continue now that we've covered the exporting and importing of information. Well, you'll see that I'm calling the function there of list item, but I'm calling it almost like if it were an HTML component with a self-closing tag. Well, that's causing the return of I am a list. I'm going to comment this out, otherwise it's going to drive me nuts. I am returning the list item of I am a list item, and that's what's rendering there on my screen. So everything's working how it's supposed to be working, right? I am mapping, I'm creating the HTML elements of all that list item, all for all 7 of the items that are within my list. If I go to completed task, it turns into 2. If I go to incompleted, it turns into 5. And if I go to all tasks, it goes back into 7. So things are working like I want them to, per se. But before I had this really nice display of everything that had to do with my list, I kind of want to bring that back. I do want to isolate the code, but I want to have that code come back and be able to interact with it. Well, how do I pass the task down to my list item? Well, let's see what happens if I do something like props, right? I'm going to go ahead and say, well, I'm going to receive props here. And for now, I'm just going to log on to my console, what those props look like. You'll notice that those props are considered an object. And I'm receiving 7 of them. So I'm receiving 7 props that are being passed in. But currently they have empty key value pairs. Okay. Well, now let's pass it in. I want the task, or I want there to be a task prop to have the task value. Let's see what we have now. Now, for each one of those objects, we have a key value pair of the task itself, where the task is reference to the object of create a sample task. Right? So I'm just passing down the task as a parameter. Well, now that I have that, I can take all this commented out code. Yeah, that should work. And bring it here into my list item. Well, now I'm getting an error. 48 of them. And it's saying because task is not defined. Well, that's true. Props is defined. And as we saw earlier in our console, oh no, it's not there anymore. There you go. As we saw earlier in our console, props has a key named tasks. So how can I fix this so that it's working correctly?
You just append props to task, so props.task.id.
Perfect. So I'm just going to go to everywhere where task dot is being referenced. I can just say props.task.id. Now when I refresh the page, everything is working correctly.
Couldn't you also do before the return task equals props dot task?
I could do something like that, right? Alternatively, I could also do something like object destructuring. Props is an object. So if it's an object, why can't I just grab task straight out of the object like this? And that's how we're passing down props into components. So let's go over what's going on here. I grab the entire tasks array. I start iterating through it, kind of like how we did it here. Now this li that we see here is its own independent component. I'll make it a different color. That we named list item. That list item component needs to keep track of the task. So this list item takes in a parameter for task, as we referenced to as the prop. we're mapping through the loop. We have that list item. We're essentially taking the task that we've created. Oh, let me pull out my eraser here because that is not what I wanted to do. We grab this task. We start iterating through them. Pass it down to the list item. That then generates our return component by creating this for every list item. And then it inserts it into our HTML for our unordered list. Words, having trouble with them. All right. Let me erase all my crazy drawings there. Does anyone have any questions regarding components and props?
So the way you have list item written now, it could only take in task. Like, so for if you want to use it for like to generate some other list of stuff, like, because when you're just writing, when you're through in props and then you say like props.id, props dot, whatever the next key is. I thought that's how it was going to look, but then when you add tasks in there, it feels like the way it's written now. If you tried to generate some other kind of list with some other subject besides tasks, like it wouldn't work.
That's a great question. Yeah, so here, what I'm utilizing this task in this first left-hand side, this is just a variable. All right, I could name this X. And by naming it X, all I would need to change is on this file, everything would be referenced to as X. And none of my code would change. Right? Everything still works. Things are still being passed left and right. That is all just, this is just a variable that I could name it whatever I would like to. In this case, I'm naming a task, not because it's the value that I'm planning to pass down to it, but just to make it readable so that I'm tracking, hey, this is the task. So I can say, hey, this is the task at parent. And maybe I could say prop task, just to make it a little bit more readable for all of us. It is being passed down as a prop. The task actually exists in the parent component, being the app. The prop task exists within the child component, being the list item. Did that help out, Jason?
Yeah, I guess I'm just used to seeing like, when you create functions, you could throw in any kind of argument and it would, like, but it just seems like this one specifically is just for the task itself.
Yes.
Maybe different key values, it wouldn't work at all. It's specifically tailored for one specific, kind of list item with task.
Got it. I see what you're referencing to now. And yes, that would be correct, right? The entire purpose of this one function of list item is to return JSX that is applicable for the task. And that's why it's important to make sure that you're more specific with your names. So if I wanted to name this something a little bit more specific, rather than naming it list item, I would say task list item. That would be more of the naming convention that would go after. All right. Any other questions?
Just for like, Kenny, can you mute yourself? Just for like clarification for like myself. So basically, components are like functions that you're importing or exporting, and props are like the parameters for the argument that you're going to pass in.
Yes.
Okay. Is there like a reason they're named differently in React, or is it just how it worked out?
That's a good question. I would have to actually do some research to figure out as to why they named it that way. When it comes down to it, the functionality behind it, this isn't just as simple as saying it's a parameter, right? Because we can view it that way, but what's happening under the hood and the way it's functioning under the hood is completely different than a parameter does when you're passing it into a function. So I think that's just the reason why they named it differently. They just want to make sure that there's a clear, like, for developers to know it, you can visualize it as a parameter, but that's not how it's actually working,
Okay, that makes sense. Thanks.
of course. And then I think Kenny, you all had a question as well.
My question was just along the lines of what he asked. A low key blanked out, but props are just, in a sense, a similar style argument that you pass into a component that you're able to pass into a component.
Yes, you could visualize it as a parameter that's being passed down to a function.
Mhm.
But it seems more like passing down an explicit argument, not just a parameter we could throw anything in.
Um, you could look at it that way as well. Yes, I think that would be a better way to look at it rather than just thinking as a default parameter that would take in any value. Just like the function is supposed to return only one functionality for one thing, you could think about the props as, hey, this is more along a typed parameter. Like you can't just pass in anything that you would like. It has to follow these specific requirements. For in this case, we have the task. It has to have an ID, a title, and a completed attribute within the object. Otherwise, it would throw an error. And that's also why people love TypeScript. All right, let's see. I think we have something from Noah. I'm going to read this one out loud here just so it's on the recording. Components are the idea of utilizing reusable code blocks within a framework. You'll find these in other frameworks such as Vue and Svelte. Yes, that's correct. Even in Django, there's similar things to components. Um, it's just frameworks try to leverage it as much as possible and repeat that, don't repeat yourself, that dry concept as much as they can. All right. All right. It doesn't seem like we have any questions. So I'm going to go ahead and do a quick review here. For part 2 of our lecture, what we covered was 1, bringing in list, filtering, and mapping through set list. We covered creating a component and how to pass down props to this component. At this point, does anyone have any questions over any of the material that we covered during part 2 of our lecture?
I think it's just going to require actual hands-on practice to figure the little pieces out.
I agree. A little bit of practical application will do the trick.
Yeah, I think today was pretty complicated. It's going to take me a little bit to wrap my head around all of this today.
Okay, awesome. There's one more concept that I want to make sure we can all see before I let the class go. And what I want to talk about is the deciding where you want state variables to live at. So let me go ahead and go into that. I'm going to go ahead and create this variable or create a new button. I'm just going to name this hide for simplicity's sake. And the idea is that every time somebody clicks this button, it will hide the task. The task will essentially just no longer be visible, or it'll trigger the filter function. We can create that function now. You can say const hide task. This function will take in an ID. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to set tasks to tasks.filter. where the task ID is not equal to the ID that's being passed in as a parameter. That's all I'm going to do. So I have this hide task and pass it in as a prop here. I'm going to utilize it down below. That's not going to work the way I wanted it to. All right, so here we have show and set show. Now have it set to true. I'm going to pass this down as show and set show. That's all being passed down as props. Now within the list item on this button, all I want to do is I want to set show to not show. All right, there you go. So the moment that I click this button, the idea is that all of the description or the nested unordered list, whether it's completed or not, would then hide. And I want this to happen at each level. Well, when I click on this button of hide, you'll notice that all of my tasks just lost their detail. If I click on hide again, all of the tasks bring back their detail. And that is happening because of where show is currently living. Show is living at the parent level. So when it's affected, it is affecting all of the children. All of the children are being affected at once because it's living at the parent level. So what I need to do is I need to make sure that show, rather than living at the parent level, lives within each independent child. So each child has its own show attribute. Well, in order to do that, I just simply take this, bring it into the list item, get rid of these props because it's no longer going to be passed in as a prop. And now when I take a look at my site here, looks like I have an error. Let me go ahead and address this error here. Use state's not defined, easy peasy. There you go. Now, when I click on hide, only the child loses its value and not all of them. And that is because each child now has its own show variable, whereas before there was only one show variable that was being shared between all of the children, kind of like a class attribute was being shared with all the instances. Well, now each one of the children or each one of this list items have their own attribute named show. It no longer belongs to the parent or the class. It now belongs to the child, or in other words, the instance. Does anyone have any questions about that?
So currently, if you click hide again, would it come back, or would it just stays gone?
That would
Okay,
come
back. Okay.
All right. Any other questions? Okay, perfect. And then let me just go ahead and add the key here again, because I totally forgot I removed that. There you go. That way that annoying little warning goes away. Yep, I refresh it. No warning. Everything's working like we wanted it to. All right. Any questions over any of the material that was covered today?
I don't have a question, but before you go to lunch, could you upload this work to the demos and notes so that we could have it for reference?
Absolutely. All right, perfect. If there are no questions, I'm going to go ahead and stop our recording here.